Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar, Construction Waste Management Theory and Practice. This is Heather Creven, the Deputy Director of the Nebraska Recycling Council. The Nebraska Recycling Council is a statewide, member-based nonprofit organization supporting communities, businesses, solid waste, and recycling industries to improve recycling collection and infrastructure. Our mission is to maximize the economic and environmental benefits of resource recovery in Nebraska and waste nothing. For those of you that are in our area, I want to make sure that you are aware of our upcoming event on Thursday, March 21st. NRC will host a construction and demolition mixer for builders, architects, haulers, and vendors at the Lancaster County Extension Office located at 444 Cherry Creek Road in Lincoln from 3 to 4:30 p.m. Local vendors that accept a variety of scrap materials from builders will be on hand to provide information on what materials they accept, quality standards, and tipping fees, if any. Vendors will include Ultra Trading Corporation, Sadoff Iron and Metal Company, Habitat for Humanity Restore, City of Lincoln's Waste Diversion Office, Green Quest Recycling, Hoffling Enterprises, Gaina Trucking and Excavating, Catherine Sons Construction, Central States Reprocessing, and First Star Recycling. This webinar and the mixer is supported by the City of Lincoln's Recycling Education Campaign. Popcorn and beverages will be provided at the mixer. Registration is strongly encouraged, and you can find a link on our website at www.nrcne.org. In addition, NRC administers the small equipment grants for the Nebraska Environmental Trust and also receives grant funding from the Nebraska Department of Environmental Quality. For more information, please visit our website at www.nrcne.org. In the webinar today, you will learn about successful construction waste management planning, how to predict the types and quantities of waste materials generated, determine the most cost-effective outlet for those materials, assign responsibility for oversight, and equip your team with the handling instructions needed to meet project goals. Daniel Hartsig, Director of Project Management at WasteCap Wisconsin, will highlight the key characteristics of each of these areas and why they're important to the project team. Lincoln Public Schools requires that all recyclable materials, such as wood, metal, and cardboard, be separated from trash during building and remodeling projects to divert as much of this waste from the landfill as possible. Brittney Albin, Sustainability Coordinator for Lincoln Public Schools, will talk about contract requirements, oversight, and outcomes on their buildings and remodeling projects since implementing this policy. WasteCap Wisconsin is a 20-year-old environmental nonprofit dedicated to turning waste into resources. They assist organizations in the upper Midwest in their zero waste journey and provide solutions and oversight for construction and demolition teams seeking to increase their materials reuse and waste diversion efforts. Daniel Hartsig is the Director of Project Management at WasteCap. He joined their team in 2017, bringing with him over 10 years of experience in sustainable building design and operation across the globe. He now focuses on waste reduction in operations and diversion of construction waste from the landfill, with an emphasis on saving money and quantifying environmental benefits for marketing efforts. Brittney Albin is the Sustainability Coordinator for Lincoln Public Schools. In this role, she manages the ongoing development and implementation of the district compost program, coordinates school recycling programs, monitors construction waste management, and provides assistance for a variety of other sustainability projects throughout the district. During the webinar, please type your questions in the chat box as they come to mind. They will be answered at the end of the presentation. A recording of this presentation will be available following the webinar on our website under the Resources tab at www.nrcne.org. Thank you again for attending. And with that, I will turn the presentation over to Mr. Hartsig, and there will be a slight delay before he begins.
Thank you so much, Heather, for that introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? Or Heather, I guess you can say, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So, as Heather mentioned, the presentation today will be split up into two parts. One part covering the theory of construction waste management and the other covering the practice. So I'll be covering the theory. And I've had the pleasure of working on construction projects, waste diversion for construction projects for over 10 years as part of a broader sweep of sustainable building design and construction methods. And so we've learned a few things over the years, but it all pretty much comes down to some real basics. You really want to understand your project, understand your process, understand your progress as you go through the project, and then celebrate your success. So those will be the topics I'll be covering today. So WasteCap, you heard a little bit about us. We're a 20-year-old nonprofit. We cover construction and operational waste, as already mentioned, so I'll skip some of these slides. We've been active since 1996, and we started tracking using our own waste management tracking software called WasteCap Trace since 2006. Since then, we've been involved in over $7 billion worth of construction, over 750 million tons of waste diverted from the landfill. And I know most of you aren't from Wisconsin, but it's the equivalent of crossing our state, and one of the highways that crosses our state, burying that highway in 6 feet of waste. So that kind of gives people a reference point to work with, how much we've managed to keep out of the landfill. So the core process is really a plan, do, check, act. If anyone's had any experience with continuous improvement, the same kind of process can be applied to construction waste management. In the planning stage, the biggest complaint we often hear from construction managers is that the design team has handed them specs for construction waste management that don't have anything to do with the project. Or the client has set goals for recycling particular materials that maybe not, or maybe not even recyclable in the area. So really, to kind of turn the conversation towards what can really be done, you need to get a really good idea up front of what are going to be the materials on the project. What are the quantities of those materials? How are you going to audit those waste streams and monitor the activity? And how are you going to track the data, or track that process as the project goes along, so that you can revise and plan to meet your goals? In construction waste management, no one out there right now is giving you more points for reusing material than you are for recycling material. But in general, there's still a hierarchy to what is most efficient and what is most beneficial for the environment, and usually also what is also most financially beneficial for your team. And at the start, it's, can you reuse those material? Can you take that material and give it a second life, either on site or through donation to or sale to other groups that can use that material for the same purpose or for new purposes. From there, you move on to the second level of recycling or composting that material. It still takes more energy and more effort, but you can break that material down and potentially reuse it. A good example might be crushing masonry in order to make new concrete. Last on the preferential chart is the actual use for energy recovery. Energy recovery kind of goes alongside other single reuse benefits, such as if you're going to take that material and use it in a landfill as alternative daily cover. Basically, that material is only getting one more use before it's wasted. And so that puts energy recovery and other single-use options down at the bottom of the list before treatment and disposal. Depending on where you are and what resources are available to you, these might come with a variety of different price tags. But the critical piece, as we already mentioned, is figuring out where you're going, where you want to hit. Is it a 75% diversion target, 95% diversion target, 50% diversion target? And what are the materials you're going to have? If you can figure out at least an estimate of the types of materials you're going to have, the amounts of each, you can put those materials together and say, all right, material A plus material B plus material C will get me to my 75% diversion goal. This is a critical first step. If your goal is especially high, for example, if you're given a 75% goal on an interior renovation project, you're going to find you're going to have a lot of difficulty hitting that target. So 95% goal on a road reconstruction is easy to hit. It really depends on the type of project, whether or not that diversion goal is going to be difficult for you and how much effort you're going to need to conduct to get there. So once you've determined your materials, determined the quantities, and started to figure out the costs for diversion of each material, you should be able to set up a plan at this point to say, these are the priority materials we're going to target. And as the project goes along, you may or may not have to add additional materials to your list. Obviously, in order to find out the prices, you'll need to call around, find out who can haul that material in your area, who can process it. The single haulers who can do a number of different materials are often a good idea. If you have access to, say, waste management, advanced disposal, somebody like that who can take a lot of different materials, they may be a good option, but they aren't always the best option. So taking the time to figure out who can process those single-use materials or single stream materials will pay off in the long run. A lot of people think certain materials are recyclable that aren't necessarily recyclable, and some people think certain materials are salvageable and reusable but carry no market value. So I've just got a quick list here of a few items you want to look for that are really key for the different types of markets. For example, for salvage and reuse, aggregate sand topsoil, easy to reuse. Wood flooring and lumber, if it's clean and has character, it can be salvaged. You'll notice even Habitat for Humanity will turn some materials away. Plumbing fixtures, light fixtures, etc. These are usually reusable if they're functional and antique, and either antique, famous, or fashionable. When it comes to being able to find a market value for material to reuse it, it really depends on the actual buyer's whims and desires at the moment. So there's a lot of flexibility in that market, and some things that may be perfectly reusable may not have anyone who wants it. Mechanically adhered carpet can be reused. Again, same with that clean and fashionable kind of criteria. Wood, plaster, and stonework that can't be made today. There's a lot of this out there, and this can carry a much higher value even than other products. For example, carved stonework or excellent old woodwork. Any wood from prior to 1945, if you're experiencing construction, you know that wood prior to 1945 was before they started to use softwoods and pines, and the quality of that material really tanked into the 1950s and 60s. Before 1945, they're still using hardwoods, high quality woods. Recycling and compost, almost always you can recycle asphalt, metals and wire, cable, all very easily recyclable. Concrete, asphalt, masonry, and stone, tend to be affected by lead paint or fire or hazardous materials. So they're not always recyclable. Wood, gypsum, and vinyl, even less recyclable than the previous categories because they're more affected by mold, fire, paint, stains, sealants, and adhesives will pretty much ruin these products. You can't recycle a piece of painted wood because, for the most part, the markets won't accept that contamination in their stream. They don't want those unknown paints showing up in their products. So as the markets move more towards knowing what the material content is in the products, the list of what they can actually be recycled is dropping for the construction industry. You also can't take that painted wood and throw it in a boiler. At least in most states, there are regulations, air regulations for what you can burn in a boiler and what you can burn in an incinerator. Waste to energy boilers have far higher restrictions on what they can use because they're not as efficient. Incinerators can usually process more material because they burn at a higher temperature. So as we mentioned, market factors will affect whether or not you can recycle on a project and whether or not you can hit your target. Just because 75% was an easy target in one county may not make it an easy target in another county. And we already talked about the movement towards transparency and material ingredients, but also labor cost in taking building apart. Deconstruction activity requires higher skill, takes more time. That hinders the amount that you can salvage. And the value of commodities fluctuates weekly. We don't see that so much on the recycling side. That is the concern of the actual processor and the recycler, but it can end up showing up in your markets. For example, in Wisconsin, wood 5 years ago was pretty readily recyclable. However, as Illinois started to get a surplus of wood, a surplus of construction demolition wood, that has pushed down the price of wood, and that's flooded southern Wisconsin with cheap or easy to get wood, and that's pushed out actually some of the recyclers in southern Wisconsin. So things that are completely out of your control will affect whether or not you can actually recycle in your area. And it's best to know these up front. So who do you use? You'll want to, as I mentioned earlier, you'll want to call around and on each job and find out who's available in the area, what can they process, what materials can they process, and how do they need it handled? How do they need it provided to them? Contamination in your recycling streams, if you're sorting out particular materials, contamination may cause that hauler to reject the whole load and send the whole load, even if it's 90% recyclable, send it all to the landfill. You want to avoid situations like that at every opportunity you get. Different haulers and different processors will have different capabilities. For example, you may have a hauler that will take wood, but it has to be clean of all nails. And then you'll have another hauler who can accept nails and other bits of metal in the process. In fact, they don't mind it because they've got a magnet. They're pulling out the metals after they chip it, and that actually gives them a little bit of a boost. So take the time to take a moment to talk to your processors and find out what they can use. If you're really concerned about recycling efficiency, you'll also want to talk to your processors about what the efficiency of their process is. A lot of people think you throw everything in the recycling bin, it gets recycled. The reality is a lot of it doesn't. And so especially when you have the difference between a commingled recycler who can take many different materials in one bin, they're only going to have a success rate between 60 and maybe 80%. The rest of the material that you throw in there is either because it's mixed up with other materials, it can't be separated easily, or it gets broken down, crushed by other materials, and turned into fines, what's called in the industry fines, which can't be really recycled readily. Mixed bits of drywall and metal and wood and various other things, concrete, too small for the screens at the recycling facility to separate out. Those are called fines. So you have a lot of loss in what's recyclable when you use a commingled approach. If you use a sorted material approach, you still will end up with some loss, some inefficiency in the process, but they'll hit usually between 90 and 95% efficiency. Once you've got your haulers in place, your materials identified, you want to explain to your crew in the best way possible how you need those materials handled, all the way from the inside of a building, if you're doing a demolition, all the way through to the exterior containers. It's critically important that you have clear signage, and that signage is in multiple languages if need be. Not everyone speaks English everywhere in the country. And you'll want to talk to each of the teams as you go through the process to explain to them what needs to be recycled and when. If you've done a good job in your planning, you'll have highlighted that at different phases of your project, you'll need different containers. You don't need to be paying for a concrete container on site if you aren't demoing concrete. Maybe you're only demoing a little bit of masonry coming through. It's okay for some of those smaller mixed materials to go into a commingled bin. If you're generating large quantities of any material, it will be more financially beneficial to you to separate those out and use separate containers. Obviously, dependent on the site, you may have a site where it's extremely limited where you can put containers. Those sites, if you can stage materials on site, perhaps you're doing a demolition of a building, it's a lot line building, you don't really have any room to put 4 dumpsters on the street, you've only got room for 1, stage some of those materials inside, pile them up inside until you have enough to do a metals dumpster on Tuesday, a concrete dumpster on Thursday, that sort of thing. It takes just a little bit of extra effort, but it does pay off in the end. Lastly, it's really critical for everyone on site to know the plan or to make their own. Many times I've gone onto a job site and the GC has the plan, everything's set up, it's working great, they've got the dumpsters, but oh, what's that over there? Oh, it's a 40-yard dumpster going to the landfill because they didn't communicate to the roofer that all the roofing waste needs to be separated out, and the roofer has his own dumpster and it's not even being tracked on the project. Usually, people only pay attention to what's in their scope of work. When it comes to waste management, you need to be looking at the site as a whole. So I mentioned earlier about paying attention to what's going in the bin to avoid contamination. That really means taking a look on a daily basis or weekly basis at what's inside these containers and finding out if what you're sending to the plastic recycler is actually all PVC. As you can see from this picture, someone dumped in right on top, they dumped in a bunch of wood and drywall and a couple other items. They probably mistook this dumpster for the landfill dumpster or something like that. So regularly inspect those collection containers, address contamination immediately. I can guarantee you if a contractor or subcontractor has to go in and remove material from a dumpster on their own dime, they will never make that mistake again. But if you can avoid that up front by making sure communication is sent down through the ranks on a regular basis, those daily toolbox talks, as well as basic orientation about waste guidelines when the contractors get on site, it'll be very helpful. So as you go through the project, a lot of companies can give you a recycling rate for your job. It's not too hard to put together a basic diversion rate. when it comes to, say, like waste, if you're using waste management or some other haulers that are doing commingled materials, they can probably give you a report on a monthly basis. Are they including everyone else on the job? Often enough, if you're using multiple haulers or multiple vendors, that single report isn't necessarily giving you a picture of the job as a whole. Are you reusing material on site? Did you make a material donation? All these things should be wrapped up and included. So you can't always rely on a single vendor to provide you a report if you're using more than one on site. Secondly, one thing about most diversion reports these days is that they'll tell you where you're at right now. They won't tell you if you're going to hit your goal. So if you are working with a consultant, one of the most beneficial things we found on projects is our ability to explain to people, oh, you're only at 38% recycling rate right now, but you don't need to panic. You're going to get to 75%. It will happen. It's because you haven't hit this phase where you're going to get a whole lot of this material. A hauler, like waste management, for somebody like that who's giving you a report, they don't know what's coming up next on your job. So they can't do that kind of predictive analysis for you. And it'll be really helpful for you to know, am I doing okay? Or do I need to make some tweaks? Do I need to say, oh, you know what? I actually do have to recycle wood on this job because I'm going to come in at 73%, and I know I'll have roughly 10% wood on this job, and I haven't focused on that yet. Okay, well, you're halfway through the job, you're not going to make it. Maybe it's time to start adding new materials. So you're looking at what's going into the bins, correcting your actions there, and then paying attention to where you're going to be at the end of the job, not just where you're at right now, to determine what changes you need to make to stay on track. And once you've come to the end of a job, it's relatively easy to put together that diversion rate, right? You've got all your reports together. You can say, I achieved 76% diversion rate. Great. What does that actually mean for the people who work there? Can you talk about it in terms that they can understand? Oh, that's so many dump trucks full of waste. Or, how much did you actually save in that process? What we find here in Wisconsin, and obviously the Nebraska market will be different, is that if you separate your construction waste, you'll be saving around an average of $40 per ton over using commingled recycling. So there's financial savings, obviously. Did you use that? Was that savings all kept by the contractor? Depending on how the contract is written, the contractor may keep any savings that they get from waste management. Maybe they used it to buy, maybe they incentivized their team by buying new tools. Maybe they donated material to the community and that went to go build something. Talk about those stories. There are ecological results, of course, as well. You can determine how many trees were saved. You can determine how much water was saved. You can determine the energy savings by using recycling instead of harvesting raw material. You can determine greenhouse gas savings by keeping material out of the landfill. There are tools out there that waste management consultants can tap into that can give you this kind of broader story of what was the effect rather than just we achieved a 76% diversion rate. So I know I covered a lot of material and I tried to cover it really quickly for the call today because we're going on to Brittney after this. But certainly, if you have any questions, if this has started to spark some conversations or some thoughts in your mind, feel free to drop some questions in the chat box, or reach out to Heather and their team in Nebraska. They do this this kind of work all the time as well. It's always been our pleasure to help. So with that, I'm going to turn this presentation over to Brittney. As Brittney let me know at the beginning of this call, she had gone through a 2014 training by WasteCap, and that had sparked the the effort at the Lincoln Public School District to target the 75% diversion rate. And so she's going to talk about, how they go through their process in actually getting this work done on the ground.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. And I'm just going to see if I can fix my display here so that you guys aren't seeing the presenter side of it. Give me 1 second here. Okay, I think that'll put us on the right track. There we go. Oh, back up. So yeah, my name is Brittney, and I'm the Sustainability Coordinator with Lincoln Public Schools, as Heather introduced me. Thank you. And I'm just going to kind of quickly be going through what we've done with Lincoln Public Schools as a result of the training that I attended in 2014, which also happened to be when Lincoln Public Schools was kicking off their last bond issue. So we had a lot of construction and renovation projects going on in the district. So for those of you that may not be familiar with Lincoln Public Schools out of Lincoln, Nebraska, we have over 41,000 students in the district. We have quite a few employees and lots of buildings to manage. And as I mentioned, we had that 2014 bond issue, which included several new construction. We had a new middle school and YMCA joint project. We had a new elementary school. We built our career academy, was first on that list. And then we also had some very large renovation projects. We had a complete overhaul of one of our middle schools, an IAQ project, and several other smaller projects along the way. So that is kind of our case study here of how we redid our efforts and revisited our guidelines. So we did redo our design guidelines. We updated them officially in 2016. So actually when that 2014 bond issue kicked off, it said in our guidelines we did have a construction waste management section, and believe it or not, it said in there that we had a 50% diversion rate. But the thing with design guidelines and project specifications, for those of you who may be familiar, is that unless there's someone asking questions about them being enforced and followed up on, that diversion rate, who knows if that happened, because there wasn't really serious attention being paid to those goals to follow up and track and ensure that it was being met. So that was an initial change, was let's start really holding our partners accountable for this and looking at our contracts and what it says in there. So we did update our guidelines in 2016, and I have just a little snippet there, but our design guidelines are public on our website. We did update it to a 75% diversion goal for all of our projects, and we elaborated in that section. So I'm just going to be pulling out a few pieces that we updated and what we've really felt has helped us have a more robust and successful program. So just a few highlights here that I'll dive into with setting that diversion goal. We required a waste management plan, went into a little more detail on materials to be diverted, talking about revenue, which may be unique to Lincoln Public Schools of how we have it set up, but something for folks to consider as they're looking at their projects and diversion, and then the importance of inspections and reporting and tracking. So we did include in our guidelines a requirement for a waste management plan, and that it is meant to be submitted 45 days prior to the commencement of work. Turning it in after a demo has happened is probably not going to be too helpful. We need to make sure that we've talked about the materials. Too often, especially early on before we updated the guidelines and had those conversations, I would get a phone call of, hey, I've got this material that needs to be out of the building tomorrow. Where can we send it? Well, I don't have the means to find a source for that material to go to in that short of time frame. So that waste management plan really is helpful for getting that list of materials ahead of time, thinking about quantities, and making sure that everyone is on the same page for the beginning of the project. That is still something that
continues to be a challenge, but through that WasteCap training, and then at the time, we actually contracted, so Lincoln Public Schools partnered with formerly WasteCap Nebraska, now Nebraska Recycling Council. We worked with them and contracted them to help us with our Irving Middle School renovation project. So we contracted their services to help with training contractors and subcontractors, developing that waste management plan so we could use that as a model for future projects. And so we did get some additional consultation for initiating this process. So as I mentioned, the materials that we recycled, we kind of revisited that list. We had some of this in there, but some of it needed to be fleshed out a little bit more or have things added to the list. Something that we wanted to add on was actually talking about cardboard. It wasn't always followed through on, and for those of you who might be familiar with the Lincoln area, it was very helpful for us to address cardboard because that is a material that is now banned from our landfill, so something that is required to be recycled. So that was one thing on there. We also just talked about enforcing some of the smaller quantity items. So you see aluminum on that list from some larger spaces, but we also talked about aluminum cans from the workers on the site. So having this be something that's embedded throughout the project and not just those larger quantities. We really wanted this to be a part of the culture on the project and not just, you know, those big quantities to meet the percentage goal. So as I mentioned, there was other materials. We went to paper. That doesn't weigh a lot compared to your brick or your wood or something like that, but it was something we wanted contractors to be looking at. They're looking at site plans and probably going through a decent amount of paper from their trailer, and we wanted that to be collected too. So it was really about looking at the whole site and what is able to be recycled in our community. Light bulbs were another thing. We wanted to make sure those were getting recycled, and we have a means to do that through our district. We're obviously, as a large organization, replacing light bulbs regularly, and we have a district contract for recycling those. And so we wanted to loop in the construction projects into that process. And then there were other materials that was really a case-by-case basis. So I'll go back real quick. So we looked at drywall, and that was really only relevant if it was a new construction project because that was where you might get clean drywall. And the ability to actually take that to a local composting facility to be used in their materials. And then PVC pipe was something we had never focused on before, and we were able to find a processor for that material in a few of our projects, but that was a new material. And Dan talked about sometimes having to stage materials inside. PVC was one that it didn't really justify a roll-off, and PVC doesn't really fit into a 95-gallon toter very easily, so that was one that might get staged in an area and get piled up even on the ground somewhere on the site, and then picked up when it seems like a good quantity for that to be picked up and for the processor. Wood pallets was another one that, you know, depending on if they were in a reusable state, we would reuse those in the district actually. And that was one that had revenue associated with it because we do get, if we have an excess of pallets in the district, we actually will sell those back and get revenue from that. And then ceiling tiles. This was a new territory for our district. We looked at how can we recycle these mass quantities when we were doing a renovation of ceiling tiles. And when talking about materials and quantities, you can run into some issues, and Dan touched on this of, you know, it depends on the markets in your area and what's available to you. And so we've hit that on both fronts. I might see a facility or a business has listed on their website that they take toilets and that they will, you know, somehow repurpose them or reuse them. So I would call them up and they'd say, yes, we take toilets. And I'd say, great, I have 100. And they'd say, whoa, 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 we do not take that many. That is going to completely overwhelm us. So some, you know, they take a material, but it's only small quantities. Others only take materials in large quantities, like ceiling tiles. They only wanted an entire semi-truckload. Well, we might be renovating 2 classrooms and they're getting all new ceiling tile, and that is not going to fill up a truck. So figuring out, well, if we have multiple projects going on, how might we consolidate the material and be able to store it, because we also do phased projects. So we'll get a couple pallets of ceiling tile during this month, and then a couple months go by, and then we'll get a few more pallets, and we do phase throughout the building, especially if the students are still in that building. And so figuring out those logistics of quantities, timing, storage, all of those things can be figured out ahead of time. What type of ceiling tile was also important, because that determined who was willing to recycle it, and how it needed to be processed and palletized to be accepted for those programs. Signage is always important. This is an ongoing thing. You can see, a sign on the ground in the mud is not going to be great, not maybe the most lasting sign as well. And so that's just something that is being revisited each time we go out to the site, and I'll talk about that a little bit with inspections. I mentioned revenue, and this is just something to consider in your guidelines. It is something that we wrote into our specifications and is in all of our project contracts. When we recycle scrap metal or other items, I mentioned like the wood pallets, we have stated in our guidelines that any revenue will actually go back to the Lincoln Public Schools recycling program. We wanted that funding to go back into supporting our school recycling efforts. And this may not always be recommended. It kind of depends on what organization you are, because that funding is typically seen as, it could be used for a celebration of their efforts. It might be the pizza money for all the effort that they've done or something like that. But for LPS being a public school district, we really wanted that revenue to help continue to fund our programs. And it can be quite a bit of revenue. So especially when we had a large renovation, they were pulling out ductwork and huge units with lots of scrap metal or copper wiring or something like, or piping or something like that. So that's just something to look at as you're deciding these guidelines. Is that something that you want to direct that revenue towards? Do you want to help it offset costs of hauling and having the multiple containers on site? How do you want to approach that? Inspections are something that absolutely need to happen, and that was right away in 2014. That was something we started doing in order to even get a handle on what we said was in our guidelines and actually starting to follow through on it. So depending on what's going on the site, you may need to even be there on a weekly basis, because depending on the project that you're looking at, things can change in a day. They can, rip out huge sections of a building and be filling roll-offs multiple times in a day. So you really need to keep tabs on some of that material. Other times, depending on how the project's going, what phase they're in, you might not be seeing as much material, and so you may go to bi-weekly or even monthly. You'll kind of get a sense, whoever is responsible for overseeing this, which someone does need to be responsible for it from the owner's side, you'll get a sense of how often that monitoring needs to happen. And so we did a mix between weekly and bi-weekly inspections, and that was also something that we contracted with WasteCap Nebraska to have their staff helping with those inspections in the beginning too. And we just kind of made our own form modeled off of the example that was given in the training, checking for contamination, signage, are they there? Are they easily visible and where everyone on the site is going to see them, and where are the containers? This has a huge impact on whether or not they get used appropriately. If all your recycling containers are in one area and your landfill container is closer to the site, guess where everything is going to go? Into that landfill container, because that's more convenient. And also when looking at contamination, we were looking at every container, especially the landfill container, because the reason you might be concerned with the recycling container is that the load is going to get rejected, which obviously we don't want. But most of our comments, our photos, our issues were with seeing recyclable material ending up in that landfill roll-off that shouldn't have been there. One habit we had to try to break on these sites was the people on the site using cardboard boxes as trash cans inside the building to scoop up, whatever debris there may be and collecting it in cardboard boxes and then throwing the whole thing in the landfill container. Well, that cardboard needed to be recycled, so that is no longer an acceptable container to just toss the whole thing into your landfill roll-off. So you're going to have to find something else or dump it out and then put the cardboard into the cardboard recycling container. And these little things of just changing practices with whoever you're contracted with, and hopefully, through multiple projects in the community as well. And then as far as tracking and reporting goes, that is just an ongoing challenge. We did put into our guidelines and contracts, we said that these reports, these monthly reports, needed to be concurrent with any pay application. So if you want to get paid for your work so far, you need to have certain documents submitted with that. And I'm not sure how that works on all projects across the board, but that's how LPS works. And so making these waste management reports a part of that pay application. So if that's not included, it's not complete and it will not get paid. This is something that we have not been rigorous about because there's so many different documents that are needed with that. And I don't know about you, but having someone's pay withheld because they haven't submitted a report is a tricky thing, a waste report at that. But it is something, as we gear up as a school district for our next bond issue and our next projects, we are going to hold everyone accountable. We feel that this first bond issue, we laid the groundwork, we made it clear these are our intentions and our goals, and we are going to be holding that standard in place for our next projects. So having it really written in there that this is a requirement, it's not just a nice to have, we need to have these in a timely manner. We give them examples of reports to use and what we're looking for. We need the detailed ticketed information so that we can follow through and verify some of that information and getting those percentages calculated easily and quickly. It's really hard to know if you're anywhere near your recycling goal, your diversion goal, if you haven't had a report in 3 months. So we don't know where they're at. And that was the issue that we were running into, is that our contractors weren't giving us those reports in a timely manner. So we didn't know if we needed to be improving efforts or exploring other avenues or know if they were going to hit that target. In terms of the success and the impact of this program, we have been able to track material and keep a lot of it out of the landfill. So you can see the tonnage there for different materials that came out of our 2014 bond issue. And we haven't always hit the 75% target. Sometimes we've been below. I know in the Irving project, when we worked with WasteCap Nebraska, we actually were above and beyond that target. I believe we were above the 80% range. So it is always project specific, but we've set that 75% as a general target. And then each project will be examined individually. Other impacts that we've seen with our efforts so far is just really having an impact, as Lincoln Public Schools in the community. We work with a variety of contractors, a lot of different subcontractors, and just a lot of different groups around the community. And we feel that through all of these experiences and training, we've helped kind of lay some groundwork in the community that this can be a reasonable expectation. Whether it's the city doing a project or a private business doing a project that wants to set these goals, we feel we've really laid some groundwork here to get our groups in the community on board with these different options. And also for LPS, this is really just part of our overall organization goals with diversion. We have had recycling programs at our schools and our different buildings. We have a composting program in most of our school cafeterias now. We do repurposing. We have an auction system for surplus materials so they can get reused. And we also have a variety of recycling options just from our district operations. We build cabinets here in our building crafts department. We have scrap metal from replacing equipment or whatever we may be doing, light bulbs I mentioned, wood pallets from our distribution center. So this really was all part of an overall goal as an organization, and it meshed well with those efforts that we already had. Quickly, I just wanted to touch on some challenges we run across. Reporting, make sure that the haulers know the expectations, because they are going to be held accountable by the contractor, and we are going to be, as the owner, would be holding that contractor accountable. So we ran into sometimes the contractor really wanted that report to get to us on time, but they weren't getting the complete ticketed information from the hauler. They were just sending them a bill that didn't have all those different details that would be needed for the diversion report. So make sure that's clear with everyone ahead of time. Thinking about space and signage, we've had some really tight sites, but just getting creative with, phasing, as Dan mentioned, or there's different size containers out there. You may have to consider just some alternatives for fitting everything on the site, and make sure they are all next to each other. Otherwise, it's not going to end up in the right place, if possible. And something that's been an ongoing challenge for us is tracking the materials that get salvaged or reused. Like we had a renovation project where a lot of cabinets came out, and those were actually put into surplus for the district, but we didn't have the best way for tracking that. So that's something we're still working on today. If I could have some recommendations, it would be making sure, as I mentioned with that challenge, then the recommendation is getting clear on that documentation ahead of time, making sure you have someone on the owner side devoted to following up on this, because accountability is important, and it won't happen if the owner isn't making it a priority. And then carefully considering your contracts and how you're setting up the obligations with this, because it could really change how things are done with the cost of hauling or containers and things like that. So if that's your expectation, you need to make that clear in the contract ahead of time. And then just aim higher as you go on and hopefully experience success. LPS, I'm happy to report, is planning to increase our diversion goal for our next bond issue. We're looking at more of an 80% target to really just step things up again to the next level, while also, as I mentioned, doing a better job enforcing all of the different elements in our guidelines. We really want to just make sure that we're following through on this plan that we've put together, and with things like the training and knowing what's supposed to happen, and really following through to make sure that everyone is being held accountable, and we're tracking and celebrating that success. So that's all I have. I don't know, Heather, if you want to take things back, or we can just leave this up, and I'm not sure if there's any questions for Dan or myself.
I do, Brittney, I do. I want to thank both you and Dan for your time, and I do have a few questions. I know we only have a few minutes left, but I'd like to at least cover a few of them. So the first question that I have, and you guys can decide who wants to take it on, are all diversion rates calculated by weight? Can you comment on lighter materials versus heavier materials for calculating the diversion rate?
So what we've seen across the state of Wisconsin, all the different projects we've worked on, is that weight is a common denominator. And so it is most easily translated between a wide variety of materials. And so that typically projects have tracked versus weight. We have seen, and also if you look at a landfill, they can smash stuff down pretty well. Density is more important to them. And so they can get down to about a ton per cubic yard in a landfill, pretty much no matter what material it is. So weight still seems to be pretty relevant for them. We have seen some projects will also look at the volume that is disposed in that sense. And we've started to see a growing trend of tracking in greenhouse gas effectiveness, and some new metrics coming up that are really looking at the total environmental impact of what you're throwing away, in which case, some like plastics may become higher weighted than other materials.
And I'll just throw out one example. We came across our wood recycling with Hartsig Enterprises. They were not giving tickets that had weights, and so we had to work with them and work with the hauler and contractor. They were giving yards that were dropped off to be recycled of wood, so we had to, you know, look up what's an acceptable measurement or weight to associate with a yard of wood waste, you know, knowing what type of wood it was. So sometimes it depends on where it's going, what weights they provide you. You may have to end up doing some calculations if they don't measure it in weight, and they might measure in yards or something like that. And I mentioned, you know, paper, aluminum cans, or you get a lot of plastic Gatorade bottles on a site. Those were all, you know, yes, that's not going to impact the weight. It was more of just having this be a standard that we care about what's going in the landfill and what we're trying not to put in the landfill. So those things, we weren't as concerned with tracking the weights. It was just the kind of culture piece.
Thanks, Brittney. My next question is that 2 of the main arguments contractors have used in opposing separation of material on a job site is that there is not enough space and it costs too much to separate the material. What strategies do you use to overcome these objectives?
So with regards to space on the site, what we typically do is work on staging and scheduling so that contractors can bring in one type of dumpster, fill it up, pull it out, and then bring in another type of dumpster and fill that up, you know, with material that they've staged on site. With regards to the cost of separation in a demo project, it can be an inhibiting factor. Sometimes it is a problem, sometimes it isn't, based on the construction of the building. In new construction, it should almost never be an issue. But yes, with demo, it can sometimes, and that's where, you know, upfront in the planning phase, when we're aiming for a 75% diversion rate, and we see that a material that we expect to be about 20% of the project is going to be difficult to separate out, we move on to the next 2 materials, you know, maybe 2 10% materials, and say, all right, well, you're still trying to get to 75%. Is it going to be less expensive for you to pull out these materials? Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. And sometimes you go after the large quantities that are easy to pull at one time, and then maybe you don't recycle them quite as much at a different phase in the project because the cost benefit isn't there. That's where a lot of upfront analysis and analysis as the project goes along is important, to be able to switch gears and not just apply blanket statements, but still with the overall goal of hitting the target for the job.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I would add to that, you covered it pretty well. We do just go through those materials and the labor that it might take to separate some things. So we've had to ask those questions of, well, there's this aluminum frame, but it has glass in it. Does it make sense to separate? Does it not make sense to separate in terms of labor or even risk to the employees? So dealing with glass in particular, it just didn't make sense in most cases. So the labor and the cost can be a question that has to be taken on a case-by-case basis. But I think it's really just a commitment from the owner that if you're going to work with us, these are the expectations. At least that's how we've been able to do it. But all projects are different.
And Brittney, my next question is for you. On your impact slide, you had signage from a stenciled spray paint. And how do you attach those signs to the roll-off?
So let me actually pull up. Oh, this is, yes. This was our best site for signage. They really put some effort into it, and they knew how much I appreciated it because these signs lasted the duration of the project. So they took pride. We had worked with this contractor on a different project, so they knew the drill this time around on this project. And just right from the get-go, they used spray paint to make signage. with the letters, you know, they had stencils, they were taking it seriously, and you can't see it. I should have included another photo, but they actually built, basically it was a, you know, 3-sided ledge there to just hook it over the side, and that made it easy to take off when the roll-off was being picked up, and then hook back on there when it was returned. That's something to consider, is that these roll-offs are going to be dragged off and taken somewhere and need to come back. So signage can get ruined. A lot of times we'll see it just leaning against the dumpster. Well, if it's a muddy site, that's going to turn into a disaster and not be lasting. And then you're ending up creating more waste because you have to keep remaking these signs. So if anyone wants more photos, I do have other photos of this signage and kind of the backside of it and what it looks like and how it's constructed. And like I said, I gave them great praise on the project.
You can kind of see it on the right-hand side of the trash dumpster. You can see the back, and side.
Yeah, yep. So, and they had one on a front side and on a different side approaching it. So if you're approaching it from either way. Now, of course, these are not the perfect signs. I think I had one where it's laying on the ground, but, you know, I mean, multiple languages on there. If you need to have more details, we haven't gotten to that level of sophistication. I know WasteCap has some examples of that, and, you know, even reusable signs and things like that. We have not gotten to that level, but these worked really well in this case for this project.
And I have another question for you, Brittney. I know that we are going over time, but I just have a few more questions that I'd like to touch on. What did LPS include in their calculation of the 75% diversion? Was it ADC and energy recovery counted? Was land clearing debris included? Can you touch on that a little bit?
Yes. So the 75% diversion included anything that was recycled, and it did include concrete that I know Dan mentioned this too, you know, that one use again. So we have our C&D landfill where it can be used as cover, which is still beneficial. It's keeping, you know, the water out of the landfill and preventing more leachate from being developed. So, you know, it's not a perfect use, but it is, you know, going to another purpose again instead of just going straight into a landfill. So we did include that in our number. And so that's where weight-wise, that's a question you may want to factor in. Is that something you're going to include? Because, well, sure, you can get pretty high percentage if you're including that concrete in there, depending on the project. We did take issue with if they were clearing out a site, I'm trying to think of what the term was you just used, and I always forget what it is. But when they're cleaning out for like footings and things like that, we did take issue with including that in there. But it's something we had to talk about, and we had to ask a lot of questions. Well, where is it going? How is it being reused? Or, you know, what's happening with that weight if we want to factor it in or not? I don't know if I covered all the bases there, but we did. I think concrete's kind of the big one of, well, do we count this or do we not count this, since it is still going to be landfill cover, but it's being used in a strategic way to still be beneficial.
And then my last question for both of you is, have zoning language or ordinances been developed to facilitate the diversion?
Yes, both facilitating and working against us in some cases. In the sense that, for example, landfill bans, if there's no infrastructure, have not been helpful. We had a very good conversation over the last couple of years with a deconstruction ordinance here in the city of Milwaukee. But the city didn't pay attention to any of the recommendations we gave and just copy pasted the Portland city's deconstruction ordinance. And the culture and infrastructure here is just not there yet to support it. So it failed. So yeah, we've had ordinances that are helpful and ordinances that are not helpful.
And I think I mentioned the cardboard landfill ban that came about in Lincoln. That just really furthered the need for that to be taken seriously on the sites because everyone was aware of it. But it hasn't really hindered because we really did have that practice in motion before that ordinance came into place. And I know the city, was working across the board trying to make sure that there was infrastructure and the means to take material like that. So we haven't had as many of the negative impacts. I would say it's more just market has been the biggest factor, which I know Dan brought up too. There were certain things that it just, didn't make sense to transport. It could be recycled, but it has to go 3 states over or something like that and making those judgment calls. But we haven't had issues with ordinances hindering things being recycled, or we've only experienced, I guess, the benefit of it.
Well, again, Brittney and Dan, I want to thank both of you for your time and your presentations. At this time, we've gone over on the webinar, so I am going to end it. If anyone has any additional questions, feel free to reach out to me, Brittney, or Dan, and we will get those answered for you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good day.